Hey everyone. Normally I would be going back to doing a literature video at this point, and I do have one in the pike that is almost complete, but I think that it's high time that I cover the Epstein case. Normally this kind of stuff would be outside the scope of this channel, but due to the political nature of this case and the very high profile public developments stemming from it, I think it would be a mistake to avoid it. That said, this is a developing story, so there are certain to be developments left out of my script, so I highly encourage you to look more into it yourself and comment your findings below. I'll leave some resources in the description. Also, this video will contain discussion of several kinds of abuse as well as self-harm. Viewer discretion is advised. Hello and welcome to Simply Radical, your personal ticket to understandable radical left-wing theory. If you're new to the channel, welcome. I'm glad you're here, and I hope you'll stick around for a bit. Most of my videos here are summaries of books written by authors better informed than me, from an MLM perspective. Sometimes I also make videos about specific ideas or events. If you've got a suggestion for me, please drop it in the comments. I'm always looking for y'all's feedback. If you want to keep up to date with my latest videos, go ahead and click that subscribe button below, and if you're a freak, you can even click the bell icon for notifications. Alright, without further ado, let's get this shit show on the road. The Epstein case, because it involves potentially thousands of victims and implicates dozens of the world's economic and political elites across the globe, is far too large a story for me to cover in depth in one video. So my plan today is to simply give you a brief overview of what we know thus far, who evidence suggests was implicated in it, and especially the political effects of the case. If you would like more detailed coverage, I would recommend Dropsite News, r/Epstein on Reddit, and the Chill Goblin YouTube channel. I'll also leave links to resources where you can directly access the emails and documents that have been released regarding this case. Just a word of warning though, there is a lot of speculation and misinformation regarding this case, so think critically about everything you hear and look for hard evidence of those claims. There is a lot of money being spent on confusing the coverage of this case. I wonder by who and for what reason. First, a brief overview of the case, and its political relevance in case you've been living under a rock for the past 7 years. Jeffrey Epstein was a serial PDF file, rapist, and human trafficker that ran a child sex trafficking ring for members of the global elite for decades. Exact dates are hard to come by, but at least from the early 90s through the late 20-teens. In 2008, he was convicted on a single state felony charge of solicitation of a prostitute, something that is definitionally impossible as the victim was under the age of consent, for which he was charged $3,000 and sentenced to 18 months in a white-collar prison, where he actually only served 3.5 months before he was released on quote-unquote work release, allowing him to leave the prison for 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. That was until he was released 13 months into his 18-month sentence and placed on house arrest until 2010. In the next few years, there were some minor legal altercations for him, but he was more or less able to return to life as normal. During all this time, including during his short stint in prison, his child trafficking operation continued thanks to his various accomplices, one of whom was the famous Ghislaine Maxwell. That was until 2019, when he was arrested again on charges of sex trafficking. This time he was detained in a real prison for about a month before he was found dead of an apparent suicide in his jail cell. Epstein wasn't always the go-to child trafficker to the rich though. Though being born into a well-off family, he was pretty unremarkable until in 1974, at the age of 21 and without a college degree, he was offered a job at the prestigious Dalton School teaching physics and mathematics. Just typical white American boomer being handed the world on a silver platter for no reason, or something else. You decide. While there, Epstein was reportedly inappropriate towards underage students, which in retrospect is not much of a surprise. He also became acquainted with the CEO of Bear Stearns, Alan Greenberg, whose kids attended the school. This proved to be his first step into the world of the global elite, when, after being dismissed from Dalton for poor performance, Alan Greenberg offered him a job at Bear Stearns. Originally, it was a pretty low-level position, but he was quickly promoted and in 1980 became a limited partner, one of the highest positions at the firm. The next year, he was asked to leave for a Reg D violation, in his own words. For those of you with a life, Reg D is a requirement for certain securities to be registered with the SEC, meaning he was probably making money by skirting financial regulations. Pretty typical rich guy crimes, and in pretty typical rich guy fashion, he was never really punished for them. The next decade or so saw him floating around doing other financial stuff I don't care to get into for other rich people. One of these rich people was Les Wexner, billionaire owner of several fashion and modeling companies. Another was Adnan Khashoggi, a Saudi Arabian arms dealer whose name might be familiar to you from the Iran-Contra affair in the 1980s, when the US government secretly smuggled arms to Iran to raise money it would then use to fund the genocidal Contras in Nicaragua. Emails released in the last few months have indicated that both Epstein and Wexner were also involved, when Epstein worked with CIA carve-out Southern Air Transport to repurpose the arms smuggling planes to instead ship goods for Wexner's companies. This is the first of many well-documented intelligence connections, not only with the CIA, but also with Russian intelligence and extensively with DASM. No, I will not be calling it the DASM because I don't respect them, and that sounds stupid. We'll be getting more into all of that later, though. The last part of Epstein's financial career that we're going to discuss saw him getting involved in Towers Financial, a corporate rating firm that more or less plundered other companies for money. Again, standard evil rich guy stuff that is completely legal. What wasn't standard or legal, though, was the fact that Towers Financial was revealed in 1993 to be one of the biggest Ponzi schemes in US history, defrauding investors of the equivalent of $1 billion. By 93, though, Epstein had conveniently already left, and despite the fact that court documents revealed that he was intimately involved in the scheme, old Jeff was never charged. It was right at this time that Epstein founded his own company and began to focus on his work with Les Wexner, who soon granted him power of attorney, meaning that Epstein was now in direct control of Wexner's fortune. Now I think it's time to take a look at what we know of his trafficking operation. It's unclear exactly when Epstein began this operation, but given the records we have available, it was certainly up and running by the early 1990s. The testimony of one of his victims, Virginia Giuffre, paints a vivid picture of Epstein's MO. Virginia, typical of the girls Epstein abused, was very poor and already well acquainted with various forms of abuse. By age 13, she was living on the streets and had already been abused by several older men. She was able to land a job at Trump's Mar-a-Lago, just down the road from Epstein's Palm Beach property, at age 16, where she describes being approached by Epstein's procurer, Ghislaine Maxwell. Giuffre was reading a book about massage therapy when Maxwell approached her and told her that Epstein was looking for a traveling masseuse. Per Giuffre, this was a cover, of course, and when Giuffre went to massage Epstein, he would assault her. The massages would happen several times a day, and for her trouble, she was paid handsomely, and allowed to stay in Epstein's lavish properties across the world, all while he paid for her massage training. Virginia, being already accustomed to the abuse, and from such a precarious financial background that she was quite literally homeless, felt she had no choice but to comply. In a court document, she stated that she was required to be sexually exploited by Epstein's adult male peers, including royalty, politicians, academicians, and businessmen. Virginia also told reporters that Ghislaine directed her to please these men in whatever way they want. I don't care how gross or kinky it is, and that Epstein, who had installed an extensive video recording system, wanted to be told about what forms of abuse these men liked. According to the DOJ, Epstein also kept CDs locked in a safe at his New York property with handwritten labels that included the description, young name plus name. Court documents also allege that these recordings were used as blackmail for business, personal, political, and financial gain. Of course, this reprehensible lending out of children's bodies for the sexual gratification of the world's elite would only begin once Epstein and Ghislaine were confident that the victims wouldn't go to the authorities. Often, this was accomplished by encouraging victims to recruit others, with the procurer reportedly being rewarded $200 per victim. This implicated the victims in the trafficking itself, making it unlikely that they would say anything about it. Often, procurers would make more money bringing victims to Epstein than the abuse victims themselves would make, meaning they were not only discouraged from reporting their own abuse because of legal repercussions, but also financially incentivized to continue enabling the abuse of others. This was not his only way to procure young girls for his abuse, however. For instance, Nadia Marcinko, an alleged victim turned procurer who was in intimate contact with Epstein up until his death and had visited him in jail more than 70 times before he died. Epstein reportedly bragged to other victims that he had bought her as a, quote, sex slave at the age of 15, presumably from her family. That's about as far into the actual abuse as I'd like to get. There is so much more to go into, and I very much encourage you to dig deeper if you have the stomach for it, but that's not what this channel is about. This channel is about materialist politics. We're here to talk about how the corrupt structure of our society created, enabled, protected, and eventually led to the death of this twisted, evil man. You see, the reason Epstein was able to run this child abuse and trafficking ring for close to 30 years with nothing but a few slaps on the wrist to show for it is because he belonged to the global ruling class. Quick question. What usually happens when a working class person with PDF file disorder is caught engaging in these kinds of criminal acts? They're arrested, sent to prison, where they're likely the target of severe violence by fellow inmates, entered into a publicly accessible record, and legally prohibited from living and/or working in places where they would have access to children. Their lives are permanently altered, and they might even be killed in part for their heinous actions. But what happened to Epstein when he was caught engaging in these acts? He was fined $3,000, spent a few months in a country club prison, and was eventually released early. The super wealthy can throw money at the problem until it goes away, assembling teams of incredibly experienced lawyers to search for technicalities, finance extensive propaganda campaigns to slander their opponents, bribe victims to stop talking, bribe them to sign NDAs and non-prosecution agreements, and call in favors from the most powerful people on Earth to minimize their consequences, not to mention what they can do when they have recordings of the elites performing illegal and immoral acts locked up in a safe. An example of one of these favors might sound something like this. In 2008, Florida State Prosecutor Alexander Acosta was looking into the prosecution of Epstein for his crimes when he reportedly received a call from an unnamed source who pushed Acosta to cut a deal with Epstein because he, quote, belonged to intelligence, and that the issue was, quote, above his pay grade. Acosta, like the good little bootlicker he is, complied. I should say now that Acosta claimed years later, after extensive reporting, that all of this was incorrect. Regardless, Epstein was back to abusing children in his mansions by 2010. Again, because he was a member of the ruling class. Epstein was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations from 1995 to 2009, as well as the Trilateral Commission, Rockefeller Institute, and the Institute of International Education for undisclosed periods of time. If you're unfamiliar, these are all policy planning networks that operate at the highest echelons of the US state, quite literally dictating the policy of the US government on behalf of all US politicians in both parties. Dr. Bill Domhoff, who studies these kinds of groups, lists the Council on Foreign Relations as the 7th most influential organization of its kind by one metric. That's 7th on Earth. Also, you might notice that Epstein remained on the Council on Foreign Relations until 2009, meaning he was actively shaping the policy of the US state for 2 years after he was initially caught trafficking and abusing children. He also, of course, donated hundreds of thousands of dollars to both the Democratic and Republican parties throughout this time, and he was close friends with some of the most powerful people on Earth, such as the Andrew formerly known as Prince and the Crown Princess of Norway, as well as Lynn Forrester de Rothschild, Ace Greenberg, Donald Trump, Tom Barack, Steve Bannon, Harvey Weinstein, Woody Allen, Noam Chomsky, Alan Dershowitz, Richard Branson, Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, Emirati Sultan Ahmed bin Sulayem, Russian state official Sergei Belikov, Bill Gates, Bill Clinton, Tom Pritzker, and not really Prime Minister Ehud Barak. He was also at least acquainted with Peter Thiel, David Copperfield, George Stephanopoulos, Mark Zuckerberg, Reid Hoffman, Steven Pinker, Elon Musk, Jack Horner, Katie Couric, Jeff Bezos, Sergey Brin, Larry Page, Louis Ranieri, Ronald Perelman, Naomi Campbell, Stephen Hawking, Rupert Murdoch, Michael Bloomberg, Andrew Cuomo, John Kerry, Alec Baldwin, David Koch, Tony Blair, Kevin Spacey, Chris Tucker, and Michael Jackson. There are, of course, more names than this associated with Epstein, both known and unknown at this time. Epstein never had a real job in his life, so what time he didn't spend trafficking and abusing children, he spent networking among the global ruling classes. But I think you get the idea. Epstein was the center of a vast network of the world's most wealthy and influential people. In fact, evidence suggests that Epstein often served as an in-between for powerful people, and often set wealthy men up with his victims once they had gotten too old for him. In one victim's testimony, by the way, that cutoff was about 16. Epstein himself liked to say that when one of his relationships is over, the girlfriend moves up, not down, to friendship status, and many of his wealthy male acquaintances conspicuously ended up marrying his ex-girlfriends. For example, Ava Anderson Dubin, who was Epstein's girlfriend in the 80s before marrying billionaire Glenn Dubin in 1994. Then, decades later, an Epstein victim claims to have been forced to give both Ava and Glenn a massage. Epstein was also named the godfather of their daughter, Chelina Dubin, before he then tried to marry her. To be clear, I am not insinuating anything about Epstein's relation to the Dubins beyond what has been reported in my linked sources, but it does align with other accounts of Epstein playing matchmaker for the global elite, often with his sloppy seconds. Another high-profile example is Epstein's claim that he was the one to introduce Trump and Melania. If all of these claims are true, it would suggest that Epstein, after abusing and trafficking girls, would marry them off to his wealthy and powerful friends once they got too old for him, read, old enough to give consent. This would undoubtedly incentivize his victims to hide the abuses inflicted on them, and also allow Epstein to expand and solidify his connections with the global elite. Thinking about it this way, the operation would seem to be a sort of pyramid scheme of child abuse that Epstein leveraged to benefit himself and his political projects. This pyramid scheme of abuse plainly takes advantage of ruling class power to coerce children into complying with their abusers, potentially for their entire lives. And that's about as far into the actual trafficking operation as I'm going to get. Again, I encourage you to look more into it yourself with the resources linked below. Now, let's talk about his intelligence connections. We've already talked about his confirmed involvement in the Iran-Contra affair in the 80s, and the call reportedly made to Acosta that alleged he was intelligence, but I also neglected to mention that Epstein himself at one time claimed to have worked for the CIA. Separately, a spokesperson for the CIA told The Guardian that CIA Director William Burns had met Epstein on 3 occasions when he was Deputy Secretary of State to seek general advice on transition to the private sector. Ghislaine Maxwell was also the daughter of Robert Maxwell, who was accused by several people of having numerous intelligence connections, and whose funeral was attended by the not really PM, president, and at least 6 heads of awesome. Certainly something that happens to people that aren't affiliated with awesome. It is also confirmed that Epstein worked with awesome in Mongolia and the Ivory Coast, and a awesome agent stayed at one of his properties several times. He was also instrumental in working with the not really defense minister to set up a diplomatic channel between the not really and Russian states during the Syrian civil war. He referred to a member of Russian intelligence, Sergei Belikov, as a very good friend, and was trying to secure a Russian passport when he was arrested for the final time in 2019. Now, there's a lot of hemming and hawing from various parts of the US, not really, and Russian ruling classes about whether Epstein was a card-carrying member of the CIA or FSB. But regardless of whether he was officially registered as an agent of any of these organizations, which I personally doubt, he had a hell of a lot more contact with all of them than me, you, and every other regular person on Earth has. And as a matter of established fact, has performed services for all of them, most especially awesome. He was clearly engaged with them to some degree, officially or not. One journalist said that he was known in the intelligence world as a hyperfixer, somebody who can go between different cultures and networks. Maybe something akin to a freelancer for the worst people on Earth. As usual though, the ruling classes and their media lapdogs are taking advantage of this vagueness to pollute the story with the narrative that most benefits them. The Democrats and Europeans, like always, want to completely ignore the not really connections and just blame it all on Russia. The far right wants to completely ignore the CIA connections and blame it all on their imaginary fascist Zog conspiracy. The Russians want to completely ignore the FSB connections and blame it all on the devilish West. But it is an established fact that he worked with them all. By far and away the most, but also extensively with the CIA. He did also have FSB ties, but he seems to have been looking to cozy up to Russian elites, meaning he was not as close with them as with US and not really elites. Material reality shows us what these propagandists refuse to acknowledge. Epstein's loyalties didn't lie with a nationality or a cause or a government. His loyalties laid with an international ruling class. From occupied Jaffa to St. Petersburg to New York. You'll find hundreds of different people from all corners of the world in the Epstein files. Royalty, presidents, prime ministers, CEOs, sultans, hedge fund managers, prominent academics, famous writers, actors, singers, and basically any and all kind of celebrity. But you know who you won't find? Any members of the working classes, other than the victims, of course. We certainly don't have all the information yet, but I'll wager my life's savings that you won't find any fucking fry cooks in there. You won't find any electricians, or cashiers, or lawnmowers, or teachers. The entire trafficking operation was built, maintained, covered up by, and catered to the ruling classes of the world. It was an organization designed from the outset to prey upon the working classes, on us, for the benefit of our sick rulers. Epstein brutally assaulted and trafficked our sisters, our daughters, and us for the benefit of the ruling classes, for presidents, prime ministers, CEOs, and so on. And what repercussions have they faced? A single person has been arrested for these heinous crimes, and the ruling classes are talking about pardoning her. None of these so-called people who quite literally preyed on our fucking children for their own twisted sexual gratification have even gotten so much as a slap on the wrist. Many who are implicated in Epstein's abuse ring are literally in the US government right now, and they might not even lose their fucking jobs, much less actually face consequences for their actions. In Europe, the worst that happened was the fucking PDF file grapist can't use the fancy title of prince. You know what he can do though? Continue to grape our fucking children. Under the capitalist class system, there is, by design, no way for us to punish the ruling classes. Because of their unimaginable wealth, they are quite literally above the law. You think they're gonna stop preying on our daughters because Epstein got caught? No. Diddy and Epstein had become liabilities, so they got rid of them, but why would they stop? They can just find some other depraved PDF file to abduct our children for them. We can't even make these people fucking lose their jobs for the crimes they've committed, much less punish them the way that they deserve. To stop this cycle of abuse and trafficking, the power that allowed them to create and maintain this ring needs to be destroyed. Their money, their wealth needs to be taken from them, their companies and properties seized, and their lying legal teams arrested, their NDAs and non-prosecution agreements ripped up and burned. Only then can they be lined up against the wall and forced to pay for their sins. This will never happen under capitalism. The same way the kings of the Middle Ages could grape and murder without any consequences, the ruling classes of today can, will, and are doing whatever their twisted, inhuman hearts desire, and decent, hardworking, normal people can do nothing but fall to our knees and beg that they stop. It was only when our ancestors, those normal people, stood up and took control of their society, starting in 1789, that the depraved kings started to pay for their crimes. And it will only be when normal people today stand up and take control of our society that the depravity of our ruling classes will be put in check, but only peacefully and legally, of course, just like Epstein was peaceful and legal. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed, like, subscribe, and check out some of my other content. Another video will be linked on screen soon. While you do all of that, I would like to make clear that I do not mean to imply any of the people mentioned in this video are or were more involved than is directly indicated in my linked sources in Epstein's operation. I have done my best to be very careful with my wording, but if anyone thinks I have implied something untrue about them, I encourage them to reach out to me directly, and I will edit the video accordingly. I also do not encourage or support any violent and/or illegal actions taken against these people, their property, or the government as a whole. My words are simply a call for accountability for those in power through peaceful, democratic, and most of all, legal means.